A few movies after his fiery breakout Do the Right Thing, Spike Lee took on the ambitious task of presenting a biopic of the famous Afro-American rights activist Malcolm X. Lee used X's autobiography as the template to his film, which I've read, and it's one of the best things I have ever read, so comparisons to it would be unfair and would handicap the film by instantly placing it on the back foot. But I will say, for the most part, Lee's film is exceptionally faithful to the autobiography, more so than the average biopic is. For the most part, the movie is a direct visualization of the autobiography of Malcolm X, with numerous parts obviously omitted for time constraints and some segments reworked to make the story move faster. Long story short, I thought the film was brilliant. It's spearheaded by a stunning performance by Denzel Washington. It's one of those where you forget you're watching an actor play a part and do the lines, and instead you get swept away thinking you're watching the real Malcolm X go about his life. In a reflection of the early life of Malcolm X, the movie's first hour or so, which is set during his youth, is quite goofy and cartoonish. And then of course he goes to prison and eventually joins the Nation of Islam, where his hatred of the white man develops and his thirst to propagate the betterment of his own people is in full flow. And this is where the film gets serious. The film's around 3.5 hours long, and though I did watch it in pieces, which obviously would have helped, I was never bored. I never thought it outstayed its welcome. It's a challenging movie, it's entertaining, and it's informative. Lee's camera is always moving, it's whip panning, it's zooming, it's doing all sorts to keep your attention on the screen. But truth be told, your attention isn't going anywhere, because you are captivated by Washington and his fine take on Malcolm X. There are few uncertainties I have about the film, or at least things that I wonder that maybe they could have been done differently. The film is so perfect in what it sets out to achieve in so many different departments, it's actually easier to talk about what I wasn't a big fan of. Firstly, something about the film feels quite impersonal. Malcolm X's story is a journey of self-discovery, of understanding, of existentialism. As great as the movie is at getting Malcolm's story onto the screen, I can't help but feel it maybe gets caught up in places in getting the audience fired up about black rights at the expense of sidelining Malcolm's personal philosophical evolution. I think to myself, why do I feel this? And I think the answer may be that there aren't a lot of scenes with Malcolm on his own, buried in thoughts that are only his. The movie isn't introspective in that way like the autobiography is, and an autobiography obviously would be. There's always people, always crowds and commotions. The character of Baines is the biggest culprit, I feel. A fictional character that in reality is a combination of many different people in Malcolm's life. The inclusion of him in scenes where he shouldn't have been in did a disservice in making Malcolm's journey feel like his own, because it doesn't feel like it's his own. The prison scene, for example, where Malcolm tries to prostrate to Allah for the first time in his life, one of the key events in his life, in the autobiography was one done in his cell on his own. The submission to the Almighty Creator and not to any man is one of the key tenets of Islam, but in the movie, Baines is in the cell with him, essentially holding his hand along the way. And you know, the movie uses Malcolm as a narrator numerous times, so the conflict and doubt he had over the action could have been portrayed this way, without Baines, using narration. In fact, you can come away from this movie thinking if it wasn't for Baines, Malcolm would have never been the legend he's known for being today, which just isn't the case. Secondly, for all the magnificent speeches and monologues, the movie seems not to address several things you'd expect in a film with such a heavy runtime. For example, what actually was Malcolm's plans? What was his goals? Were they implemented? Which ones failed? Which ones succeeded? For all the movie achieves, it's not uncommon to come away from the film still not knowing what exactly Malcolm X did. Yes, he's a symbol, but what else? Thirdly, I have some issues with the movie's portrayal of the Nation of Islam and Malcolm's pilgrimage to Hajj. It becomes clear at some point in Malcolm's life, during his pilgrimage, that the leader of the Nation of Islam is a fraud, a greedy hypocrite, false prophet who used the name of Islam to brainwash young, angry black men into doing his bidding, the end result of which pretty much, as often is, resulted in his pockets being filled up. Now when this becomes clear is when Malcolm goes to Hajj after being suspended or thrown out of the Nation of Islam after jealousy right from the very top pushes him out. During his travels, he met scholars who were familiar with his people's struggles, but also told him the Islam he preaches is not the real Islam. He was introduced to and accepted orthodox Sunni Islam as his belief, and it's in this state he returned to the US, and it's in this state he died. The movie, quite stunningly, leaves all of this out, instead muddling things and creating confusion for those not already familiar with the story. I do wonder that, wouldn't people who know nothing about Islam watch this film and think, well, if he left Islam and now denounces Elijah Muhammad as a messenger of Allah, then why does he still call himself a Muslim? It is very unclear on all of this, and it's actually quite shocking that the movie removed such an important part of Malcolm's life when it included so much else. Now that I mention it, the movie is a bit long in the tooth during unimportant scenes, like all the dancing early on, and tends to whiz past during some of the more important stuff. What the movie does thankfully get right is that Malcolm went to Arabia, saw that people of all colour, of all race were unanimously worshipping the same God and knew each other only as brothers. Skin colour never came into the equation. He then acknowledged Islam, the true Islam, as America's only answer to its race problem. He also denounced his earlier ways in painting all white people with the same brush. Thankfully, the film gets this right, and it's an incredible feat that in the current Saudi regime, the filmmakers were the first allowed to film in Makkah, or Mecca. But they did leave out some fundamentals in a movie where there are so many supplementary scenes, which is awkward. I know there was a hoo-ha when the movie was in development that the movie had to be made by a black man. There were campaigns and everything, I think. And even though I think that's a little bit weird, if you are going by that mindset, I might go one further and say that maybe it should have been directed or at least written by a black Muslim. He's perfectly within his rights, of course, as is the way of auteurs, but there is a slight feeling that in spite of how surprisingly restrained and mature Spike Lee's film is, his own personal ideology and way of thinking leaks into the film. Take the final scene. After a heartwarming compilation of real-life footage with a voiceover of Ossie Davis's eulogy, Nelson Mandela starts a speech in a classroom that was done by Malcolm, talking about all the rights they need to have, and then it cuts to a shot of X saying, "by any means necessary," and then the film finishes, which is not Malcolm X in, for the lack of a better phrase, in his final form. You undermine the man and his magnificent transformation that you've just shown us by having the movie end on one of his more radical lines from the Nation of Islam days. I mean, did you, as the filmmakers, not just watch the previous half hour of your own movie? So yeah, I do have a few issues, and in fact, most of this review is me talking about what I didn't like about the film. But one of the reasons is that there is so much that the movie delivers perfectly. The costume design, the lingo of the time period, the use of editing and camera movements to drive emotions were all top-notch. It's as good and as comprehensive of an autobiography as I could have hoped for. I won't give it a 9 out of 10 mainly because of the 3 mentioned points, but an 8.5 sounds reasonable enough.